last week, and then we'll move into Chapter 5, which is dealing with photosynthesis. So if you want to take a second and look over your handout from Chapter 4 or your notes, let's see if you guys have any questions about passive versus active transport. Because we will be using these concepts in Chapter 4 and Chapter 5. We really need to understand simple diffusion versus facilitated diffusion versus active integration. Any questions? Kind of comfortable with it? On what? One slide? All right. Cell transport mechanisms experts, right there. Right? Yes. All right. If you don't have questions yet, that's fine. But certainly, if you do, ask me. You come out of my office hours or whatever, and I'll help you get started on that. I would like to go ahead and transition to Chapter 5. If you didn't bring your handout, you at least have the first 2 pages that I gave you guys last Thursday. I printed for you guys. But the bulk of the handout was published, I think, yesterday, and it sent out an alert for you guys that it was available. I'm sorry? Oh, okay. Thank you. Somebody else needs one. Mr. Fuller has one in the back. All right, so we are moving on to photosynthesis. And the concept is simple, but the details are not. Okay, so let's talk about it. What is photosynthesis? What plants do to make food. Okay, and plants are one type of species, but not the only type of organisms that actually carry out photosynthesis. We're going to learn that some protists and bacteria they also carry out, and even there's some animals that carry out photosynthesis. There's some sea slugs that live in the ocean that have chloroplasts. They can carry out photosynthesis. So it's kind of weird, but there's always kind of unique exceptions to the rule. So we're going to talk about photosynthesis and how photosynthetic organisms can use what to make food? Can use the sunlight energy. Very good. And what we're going to study in this chapter is we're going to look how plants, we're going to focus on plants, but as you just noted, plants aren't the only organisms that actually carry out photosynthesis. And we're going to see how they take that light energy and produce chemicals, or described a minute ago, food. We're going to talk about the overall reaction of photosynthesis. And then your book goes into a little bit about evolution. We really won't get into the evolutionary impact, but it's certainly tied into this whole class. Everything is interrelated. We're going to talk about pigment molecules and how they are capable of accepting light photons. Talk about brief structure of a leaf anatomy. We'll talk about the light reactions and the carbon reactions of photosynthesis, including the synthesis of a molecule called ATP, which you've become familiar with, and another molecule called NADPH that allow for the next phase called the light independent, or the carbon reaction. And at the very end, probably on Thursday, we'll compare and contrast different photosynthesis and different types of organisms. They're called C3, C4, or what's called CHEM, and I'll elaborate on that probably on Thursday. Okay? This next bit of information that I have is just to remind for you what we learned in Chapter 4 is that our first and second laws of thermodynamics. First law tells us what? Energy is always transferred, bless you, and lost. Okay? And with each transformation, the energy, the system becomes, some of it's lost as heat, and the system becomes more what? Entropy? There's more entropy, or more, did you say it? Actually less stable, it becomes more what? Disordered. Okay? And so our greatest source of energy, we noted, comes from the sun. Okay? And the sun potential energy is going to be captured phototropic, or you could say photosynthetic type organisms. They have the ability, they have molecules with them to capture light photons to produce nutrients or chemical nutrients. So basically that's what we'll study here in Chapter 5, how these organisms capture light energy. Once these phototropic organisms produce nutrient molecules like glucose or starches, etc., then other organisms such as yourself, or described here as chemotropic organisms, can consume that food source, if you will, and continue to convert into nutrient sources. So we're all just interdependent upon phototropic organisms. If there were no photosynthetic organisms here on Earth, what would happen? bad, right? We wouldn't live a life on Earth as we know it would halt, okay? And so we rely upon these photosynthetic organisms. Okay, so photosynthesis is a big deal. Okay? If we want to study photosynthesis, right, there are some key things, okay? Excuse me, I've got some visual analogies. Just to make sure that I reminded you that it's not just plants that carry out photosynthesis, right? So you might be thinking about plants, flowering plants, springs coming up, grass, those kinds of things definitely carry out photosynthesis. But also aquatic plant species can carry out photosynthesis, as well as some bacteria can carry out photosynthesis. And there's some rare exceptions, the sea slug is kind of weird how it does that. If we look at what photosynthesis is dependent upon, well, definitely we need what? We definitely need sun, okay? Oh, well, we'll give you a little picture in a minute. But what it's going to rely upon are those reactions that you said you didn't want to get a hold of. Oxidation, reduction, reaction. It's going to rely upon what? Let's say another way to say this. Redox reactions, or what's another way we could say this? Relies upon moving what? Removing what? In the form of? Not protons, not neutrons, electrons, okay? Remember our oxidation reduction reactions is just transferring electrons from one molecule to another. If a molecule is oxidized, what's it doing? Losing electrons. And if a molecule is being reduced, it is gaining electrons. There's a really good mnemonic device to keep that straight, and I didn't even think about giving it to you guys, but in my online class, someone found it and brought it to the class. There's an easy way to remember this. The acronym oil rig. Oxidation is lost or losing. Reduction is gaining. Okay, so you may want to write that short little mnemonic device down to differentiate oxidation versus reduction. Right, we know it's losing what? So losing electrons. And then oil rig can help you that might help you remember the difference between the two. So in other words, you don't get by with just learning what they mean. We're going to put these into practice. We're going to move electrons from one molecule to another. In other words, we're transferring energy from one molecule to another. And it's really slow. Well, I'm going to take that word back, but it's a really procedural, right, series of reactions. Okay, so it's just very much controlled. So we can control the what? We want to control this because we want to control the energy transfer. Right? We're regulating electron transfer, we're regulating energy transfer. So going back in summary, I said photosynthesis, we're going to see some oxidation reduction reactions going on everywhere. You guys also noted we definitely need the sun. Sun's critical to the photosynthetic process. Without it, wouldn't even start. Okay? Also dependent upon water. Water is necessary. When you write the word water down, I want you to put in parentheses, this is your source of electrons. Water is going to be the actual source of electrons. So the sun gives us light, which is energy. The water gives us electrons. What else do we need? What else do plants need besides sun and water? Some form of carbon, and it's called carbon dioxide. So definitely need carbon dioxide. And the carbon dioxide provides carbon. Water provides the electrons, bringing electrons to the party. Sun's bringing light energy, carbon dioxide is bringing carbon. To oversimplify it, without looking at all the stuff that we're going to study over the next 2 days, what's the output of photosynthesis? The sugar and oxygen is actually liberated as well. So oxygen is a gas that's liberated, or you could say freed out into the atmosphere. It may be, just right, oxygen is produced.
Is that what they mean when they say that oxygen is a byproduct?
Yes. Oxygen is a byproduct. It may go out into the atmosphere, may actually be used in that cell's mitochondria as well, chapter 6. So the plant may let it go, or the plant may use it. So that it is definitely a byproduct. The final product that we really care about is not oxygen, but some sugar such as glucose. Okay? And the plants will synthesize variants of sugars like glucose to form carbohydrates. If you remember, we said plants can store starch, or they may utilize them to make their cell wall. You keep naming it. And they can make a variation of carbohydrates as well. So, at minimum, coming into the class, you should know this, right? For a plant to do, maybe you didn't remember the word photosynthesis, but a plant needs sunlight, it needs water, it needs carbon dioxide, right? And you know that it gives off oxygen, you know that it makes some food, now you know the sugar. Now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty details of what happens in order for that to take place. If we look at the overall reaction for photosynthesis, there's going to be, we're just to look at a single, collective, easy way to summarize this. 6 molecules of carbon dioxide to be utilized, combined with 6 molecules of water. Plus, there's got to be an input of light. My E stands for energy. And that will produce what? What is this? Sugar. Okay, most specifically, that's the formula for glucose. The sugar's fine. And also liberates oxygen. The byproduct. Just to keep you informed, and we're going to see photosynthesis take water and carbon dioxide plus an input of energy to make sugar and oxygen, chapter 5. In chapter 6, we're going to reverse that arrow so that we take oxygen and sugar, release energy and carbon dioxide and water. And so chapter 6, we're going to reverse it and look at the intricacies of oxygen is used to utilize nutrients. So for right now, we're going to work with the input of carbon dioxide to make carbon-containing food sources. Does everybody have this reaction written down? Give me just a second. Okay. Just got a very simple overview animation of what's going to happen during photosynthesis. This is definitely studying in a plant, but we know that these aren't the only organisms that can carry out photosynthesis. The photosynthetic organisms, not organisms, but the organs or the tissues tend to be the leaves of a plant, again, and they're there to capture, just be bombarded with light photons. So this is going to actually zoom in and look at the structure of a leaf. I'll come back to this and we'll look at the different areas of the leaf structure. But if we zoom into a given cell that does carry out photosynthesis, which organelle should we go to? The chloroplast. Okay? We covered the brief anatomy between the outer membrane and the inner membrane and the thylakoids stacked up in individual grana. And what we're going to see is water. We don't see the little light photon in here, but light is going to excite water so that it can give up electrons to this pathway. As well, when this happens, we're going to produce ATP. Remember that? And we're going to make ATP in another electron transferring molecule called NADPH. So it's going to be involved with this transferring of electrons. That'll happen during what we're called the light-dependent reactions. We'll make ATP and some other, like this NADPH. That will give energy to a next series of reactions called a Calvin cycle. And in the Calvin cycle is where the carbon is actually utilized to make glucose. It's going to take a lot of energy to add that carbon to something, and so we know that something has to happen before to give energy, ATP and NADPH. So it's really a two-step process to look at photosynthesis.
So is water used to make ATP?
Indirectly, yes. Not directly by any means, but indirectly it is. Because we're going to take its electrons, and its electrons are going to be used to create a hydrogen ion gradient, which drives the synthesis of ATP. So, in a roundabout way, yes, definitely. Additional questions at this point? So that's a super short overview of photosynthesis. But to better understand it, we have to have an idea about light. Okay, so I am not a physicist, so I can only go about this deep talking about light and photons. Okay, but what I'd like for you to keep in mind, and this really helps me understand the photosynthesis a whole lot better. To us, light is intangible, right? And it's hard to, we can detect it. We've got light receptors in our eyes. However, it seems like I can't harvest it, right? It seems intangible. But light is actually physical particles smaller than the atomic nuclei bombarding the Earth. So where I'm going is, I want you to think of a photon as a thing, okay? An actual particle that's just flying, bombarding the Earth. Okay? The structure of light photons is being still studied. For example, this image from an article published in 2012. They were able to actually capture, try to interpret the structure of a light photon. The particles move so quickly, all the pictures aren't reliable. I don't know if reliable is the right word, but consistent, because they're changing properties of the light. So think of a light photon as a thing. Okay? But you're okay with that caution I'm giving you? It's a particle that's bombarding, that's displaying off of the sun. So these things called photons are what initiate this process called photosynthesis. Light photons are measured in what's called wavelengths, and you're probably familiar with this concept as well. If we look at the different types of wavelengths, there are short UV. What does that stand for? Ultraviolet. Okay, so the short ultraviolet waves actually have the greatest amount of energy in them. Okay, so they have a very high energy. Next on the spectra is what you're familiar with, is the visible spectra, or the visible light waves. And these will have more intermediate energy, and these produce the visible rainbow. Remember the Roy G. Biv, red, orange, yellow, etc., etc. So that's the visible spectra that we can detect with our optic nerve, with our eye. The more long wavelengths, what do you think they have energy-wise? Lesser. Okay. Lesser energy. And so the plants will utilize which? Actually, it's not the short, not the long. It's the visible. Part of the visible light spectra is what's captured by the plant. Not all of it, but quite a bit of the visible light spectrum is utilized by plants and other photosynthetic organisms. Figure 5.3 in your textbook illustrates just not this exact image, but it illustrates for you that visible light spectrum. And I'd like for you to note that, look at this image. What can you interpret about plant use of the light spectra? Which colors does it not utilize? Green or yellow. Okay. This is why plants appear green, because they're absorbing most spectrum and doing what with the green? Reflecting. It's not absorbing it, right? So it's reflecting it, and that's what we can detect with our eyes. So plants appear green because they scatter the green and the yellow visible rays, and they're absorbing, just kind of consuming, if you will, everything else. Okay? Does that make sense? Yes. Photosynthetic organisms appear green because they don't have the ability to absorb the green spectra, and so it just is reflected off. They absorb everything else, use it, and so it's using, and so it's not being picked up by your eyes. Correct. Correct. Yes. And that's what's being bounced off, and then and then our perception. Yeah, it's a little bit complicated. And completely off topic, however, probably interesting to you. Ever been in a relationship, and you ever get to the picking out what to wear phase? Like if you're like in a real relationship and you're like living together, and you're like, the man's waiting for the woman to pick out the clothes and they don't match to her, and the guy's like, seriously, it's blue. Somebody's like, no, this is fuchsia, and whatever. Women have the ability to detect and perceive more spectra. It's now been supported that the reason women tend to differentiate more colors is because we have the ability to detect and perceive more colors. So the guys really just think they're two colors instead of, or excuse me, one color instead of two colors. So, FYI. So you can blame science on your relationship problem. Alright, so if you remember, we said that plants have the ability to absorb some light photons but reflect others. So in order to absorb them, there has to be something about the plant to absorb it, and those are called pigment molecules. And they're called pigment molecules, or pigments. There's different types of pigments, and I use the word, I don't think your book used the word primary, but I'm going to assign the word primary. Those are the types of pigments that do the bulk of the light photon absorption. And this includes a molecule called chlorophyll A. Chlorophyll A is the name of this primary pigment that's responsible for absorbing most of the light spectra for photosynthetic organisms. It's not the only pigment molecule. There are other pigment molecules. They're called accessory pigments, including a molecule called chlorophyll B and carotenoids. Carotenoids probably reflect which light? Orange. Okay. They should be able to pick up the reds and reflect the oranges. So things like orange. And I have the little ellipses here. There's other accessory pigments that can pick up other ranges of the visible light spectra that do display off red appearance or orange or yellow as well. For this class, we'll focus on chlorophyll A. We're trying to get the basics behind it. And another piece of interesting, maybe at least interesting to me, is when we look at these structures, we assign them the ability to absorb light photons. That's not all that they do. I mean, we're not going to go into the diversity of them, but they do have the ability to store nutrients, okay, and other actions as well. Sorry. If we look at the structure of chlorophyll A, I'd like for you to kind of make some notes about it. If you don't have your notes, you can try to draw something kind of similar to it. You can always do the head and the tail kind of basic structure. I want to first start on this right here. Look at the note for this. This is described as being what? Hydrophobic. Okay? So we just see this carbon-hydrogen tail, a lot like we saw where? In lipids, in our membrane. So in addition to noting that this tail of chlorophyll A is hydrophobic, I'd like for you to add that this is the part that's actually integrated into a membrane. And most specifically, that's what's anchored into the thylakoid membrane. This tail is what anchors it or attaches it into the thylakoid membrane. And so it doesn't just float out randomly. It's held into place in the thylakoid membranes because it has a hydrophobic tail. So the tail just kind of anchors, if you'll let me use that word, secures the chlorophyll molecule into place. So that's not the working part. It's not the reactive part of the molecule. Where do you think the reactive part is? The top part, the green part, okay, is the reactive part. And most specifically, the very middle, can you see the magnesium abbreviation in there? That's the reactive part. That's where electrons are going to, normally these are get excited. So again, the purpose of the tail is to do what? To kind of anchor it into the thylakoid membranes. The upper portion, the head region, is for reaction. Okay, absorbing what? What is it absorbing? Light photons. Or it's absorbing what? Easy way to say it is it's absorbing energy. Any questions about the basic? I mean, we're not getting into much into it, but the basic structure of chlorophyll. All right, now let's look at a little better detail about plant leaves, because that's what we said, we're going to focus on plants. although we know that they're not the only things that carry out photosynthesis. So let's look at a basic leaf structure. If you have your handout, bottom of page 2 has a very simple cross-section of a leaf. So this is taking, right, you can go outside, grab a leaf, and just cut it and look at it in the microscope and look on the inside of it. Okay, you're turning on its edge. So it's just a flat, does that make sense? Okay, where we're looking at. The outer portions are called the epidermis, and that may sound familiar because you also have tissue called what? Epidermis. Obviously different organism, different cell types, but same purpose, to do what? To protect. So we have epidermal layers on the top and the bottom of the leaf to protect the tissue. In the middle, the bulk of these cells are called mesophyll cells. mesophyll. So just most of the cells between the two epidermal layers, okay, without getting into botany, etc., we'll just call them mesophyll cells, okay? And what is it about the mesophyll cells? What do they do? Probably not usually. They react, they carry out photosynthesis and transport nutrients out. These aren't generally, and they can store some, don't misunderstand me, but the bulk of nutrient storage is somewhere else in the plant, the fruit, for example, or a tuber, right, the thing that you might eat, think about something, is where the nutrients are stored. So not much, there is some, but not the bulk of nutrient storage is here at the mesophyll cells. But their primary job is to carry out photosynthesis, to produce the sugar, and then transport it out to the rest of the plant to use or store. Both the light-dependent reaction and the Calvin cycle will occur here. They collectively are photosynthesis. So yes. Good job. Additional questions about the mesophyll cells? Yes. They not only help, they carry out photosynthesis. They do all of the steps of photosynthesis. So that's the word on, yes, photosynthesis. You may also recall that respiratory gases have to get in and out of the cell, and there's specialized large openings at the underside of the leaf, and they're called the stomata. S-T-O-M-A-T-A. The stomata are pores on the underside of the leaf that can open or close, depending on light availability, and heat, right, other factors. So they can close if the plant needs to conserve, or open if it needs to exchange. But those are found on the underside. Can you see? It'll open. There's variations of why they might open or close, but it's heat, which would attain to if the plant needs to, if it's too hot and it needs to conserve water, the stomata would do what? Close, okay, to conserve. And if temperatures are okay, water availability is okay, the stomata can open and gases can freely diffuse in and out. Yeah, it protects, and it also is just a source of gas entry and exit. So what gas could get in? CO2. Which gas could get out? Oxygen. Oxygen. That is really just the basic structure of a leaf, okay, without getting into variations in different species. Okay. The protective epidermal layers. On the under epidermal layer, we have the stomata, which are just openings for gas exchange and water conservation. And in the middle, we have the mesophyll cells that carry out photosynthesis. Any other questions about basic leaf anatomy before we move on? Yes?
The little circle dots are those
No, that it would not be a nucleus. I can't see, it's not cut real clear. It might be part of the vascularity of the plants because they're actually cells that form vessels analogous, they're not the same, but analogous to the blood vessels in your body. But these transport xylem and phloem, which is that nutrient, the stuff to help make the sugars and also transports the sugars out. So it's not real apparent that that's what that is. It's probably what it is. If you want to find a single nucleus, I can't see an apparent nucleus, but I could definitely see lots of chloroplasts in here. You see the little dots? Each little dots are a single chloroplast. Okay, so can you see the green dots? Individual chloroplasts? That's why that's more green, like pigment looking, so it's where all the photosynthetic reactions will occur. I don't see an obvious nucleus in this image, but each of these little areas would have a nucleus in it. But that's multiple cells. Additional questions? Where we want to zoom into is in those mesophyll cells and look at this organelle called the chloroplast. And it was identified last Thursday. Well, we already covered this in Chapter 3. Well, actually, we became just introduced to it in Chapter 3. We're going to look into it in really big detail in this chapter. And just to review for you the basic chloroplast structure, we have the outer membrane as well as the inner membrane. And what did I have you guys note on your handout last week about the purpose of the outer and the inner membranes? They transport molecules in and out. We don't need that chloroplast so isolated from the inside of the cell that maybe it makes something but doesn't share it, right? Nutrients have to get in, nutrients have to get out. The whole purpose of the chloroplast is to give nutrients to the cell, and so it's got to get the products out as well. So there's actually transporter proteins in each of the membranes. We also noted, though, on Thursday, it does serve protection, right? It compartmentalizes the reactions of photosynthesis here instead of just having it all out crazy in the cytoplasm.
So does the outer membrane have pores?
It's more porous, and the inner membrane is more regulated with specific transporters. Good observation. Additional questions at this point? So we are going to kind of focus in on the innermost portion. Inside of the chloroplast, we identified that we can have these stack of flattened membranes collectively. One would be called a granum, or you could look at them all together, they would be grana plural. Okay? And what are the grana comprised of? Thylakoids. Okay? And each little flattened disc is a thylakoid. Yes, good. Yes, the innermost compartment of the thylakoid that looks really boring in this image, just darkened out, is what I refer to as the lumen, or in the book it calls it the what? Thylakoid space. Okay?
So the thylakoid is the stack of all of them?
The stack is called a grana,
Right.
and it's made of multiple thylakoids. So a thylakoid would be one. Be analogous to a student in a class. A class would be the granum, the thylakoid would be the student. So you guys are a class, you guys can make a granum, but you're individual thylakoids. Does that help? Yes. What I don't want you to forget is that these things are made up of membranes. Okay? Phospholipid bilayer, semi-permeable, all those features about membranes we're putting into practice here at the chloroplast. Okay? They can't add everything to this image, and so it looks kind of devoid or like it's a vacuum or something. Is this a vacuum in here? What's inside of there? Fluid. And what is the name of the fluid surrounding the thylakoids? Stroma. The stroma is the liquid in which the thylakoids are suspended. What else is in there? Your book makes sure to identify. Definitely ribosomes and DNA. Okay, so chloroplast got it going on. They are making proteins. They're doing everything. In addition to photosynthesis. In your handout on the thylakoid section, I have a note about the membranes. Okay, so we know that it's a membrane, but I want to address your attention to what is in the membranes. Okay, they're phospholipid bilayers, but there's also proteins. And what else is in the membrane besides proteins? Pigment molecules. Okay? And so I want you to acknowledge that the thylakoid membranes, as we noted a minute ago, is what holds the chlorophyll and other accessory pigments. And if we were to zoom in, if you will, on a given thylakoid using the image from your textbook, okay? You notice we're looking at a single section of a single thylakoid and zoom in. Looks kind of scary or maybe pretty at first. And the yellow is representing what? The phospholipid bilayer. Good. And what are the colorful things representing? It's not direct. Actually, it's tricky. Do what?
Light.
Actually, not the light either, or the pigments. It's looking at really in structural detail the different proteins that are incorporated in there. And so this is just, if you remember we talked about proteins can have a unique three-dimensional shape. This is showing, kind of trying to allude to that three-dimensional structure. And so what this tells us is in the thylakoid membrane, there are proteins in there. And in the very middle of the proteins, what you guys were looking or focusing on is our pigment molecule called chlorophyll. And so if you look at this, you see the little protein, and you see the chlorophyll molecule in there. They're all grouped together. They must all be doing what? They're grouped together. They must be. They are structured together. They must be functioning together. They're working together. Okay? And collectively, these proteins with a primary pigment, chlorophyll A, they make what's called a reaction center. Okay, so the reaction center, you got that on your handout. The reaction center is a chlorophyll A molecule plus surrounding proteins that help carry out which process? No, let me address that in just a minute. Okay, so just for right now, you can say the chlorophyll A plus surrounding proteins, and then you can go ahead and add in there plus antennae pigments. I'll clarify that in just a moment. I need your imagination. Okay, so I've got a way to describe this. It just popped up in my head, so hopefully it'll work. It may not. Okay, so envision you're like at a rock concert. I don't know what the right term is, but where they have mosh pits, where they have, what is that kind of concert called? Do what? I don't know. Probably metal. All right, some metal concert, right? And envision like our mosh pit, right? There's a bunch of people, okay? They're all grouped together, okay? So you with me so far? A bunch of people grouped together, and they're kind of excited, right? So sunlight's hitting them. They're excited. Sunlight's hitting them. We're going with this reaction center. They're making a reaction center. In the middle is going to be one person, our reactive chlorophyll A. Okay, so center of the party. Okay, the middle of the reaction center. Right? So we've got one person who's going to do a lot of work, and a lot of people around them that's going to transfer a bunch of potential energy in there. Okay? That's what these proteins and these accessory pigments do. Light is going to come in, it's going to react in the middle. Okay? But what has to happen, though, is there's so much light energy in a single photon, we've got to be able to use it wisely. Okay? And so what we're going to do, if you remember, we said the whole point of this is to transfer electrons. Okay, so let me help finish out this visual. Let's think of an electron as a hot potato going through this crowd of people in a mosh pit. Okay? Once the hot potato gets thrown to the outside of the people, okay, they're getting they got some energy, and they can throw it to the next person, right? And the next person, right, can catch the potato, right, and can pass it on. Okay? Eventually, we're trying to get where? To the middle, okay? To the chlorophyll. Okay? Where did this electron come from? In your notes, when we started, water. Okay, so it's going to be a which came first, right, kind of scenario, but there's going to be electrons, and they're going to have so much energy, we need to kind of hand them off a little bit, because you remember, with each transformation, what happens? Energy is lost, okay? And so what happens is the hot potato, the electrons, hand it off to the edges of the people in the party, okay? So that by the time it gets to the middle, it's a little bit more what? Lower in energy, a little bit cooler, a little bit more where chlorophyll A can use it. Okay? So that's what's going to happen in these reaction centers. Is electrons are going to boom, 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 bounce off, and get handed over to chlorophyll when they're ready. And then sunlight's going to boom and just blast them with energy again. Okay? It's really not that simple. There really aren't people inside of chloroplast, but hopefully that kind of gives you a visual of what's happening. Electrons are getting passed around between these accessory pigments so that they can get ready and stabilized, captured at the chlorophyll A pigment. Does that help a little? There's a lot of transferring going on, basically. So before we get into the details, and hopefully I'll give you a visual when we come back and talk about the reaction center. But for right now, the reaction center is a cluster of what? Proteins and chlorophyll and other accessory pigments. They're going to move what? We're going to see them doing what? Moving, and more specifically moving electrons to transfer energy. This is all located where? In the thylakoid, and actually in the membrane of the thylakoid. All right, so let's go ahead and look at the overall, what's the point of photosynthesis? There are two major components of photosynthesis. They're referred to as the light dependent, and the other is what? The Calvin cycle. I may call it the light independent. Does that make sense? It doesn't need light. Okay? But the Calvin cycle is a little bit more appropriate. If we look at overall what's happening, the light-dependent reactions occur where? We know where. In the thylakoid membrane itself. Okay? So the light-dependent reactions occur in the thylakoid membranes because that's where we have our chlorophyll pigments located. What it does here I have an in your handout I have it listed as reactants. Well, we definitely know we need light. Okay, so that's going to provide energy, okay, solar photon energy to the system. We also need, what else do we need to initiate this? Water, okay, which is going to bring electrons. Good job. Okay. So the light-dependent reactions, that's where the sun is going to be utilized to energize electrons that have been stripped from water. In this process, some byproducts are liberated. This is where oxygen is liberated as a byproduct. That oxygen, we said, could be sent out to the atmosphere or what? It could be used inside of that plant. It doesn't have to go out in the atmosphere like you might presume. Also released as a result of the light-dependent reactions are hydrogen ions. So they're going to have a role, a very important role, which we'll probably better talk about on Thursday. Also liberated is a molecule called NADPH. I believe I introduced this term to you when we talked about coenzymes in Chapter 4. And this is being a coenzyme, and it's going to transfer electrons. As well as ATP is produced following the light-dependent reaction. So the light-dependent reactions don't make any what? What is not made here in the light-dependent reactions? Glucose. Sugar is not made. What we're seeing is the light-dependent reactions taking light energy and transferring it into something usable for the cell, including ATP, NADH, and hydrogen ion. It's just kind of setting us up for the next phase. The light independent, or the Calvin cycle, actually utilizes those inputs to make our sugar that we're kind of going for. And so where will the Calvin cycle take place? Where? It's not in the thylakoid membrane. In the stroma. Okay, good guess though, because it's right there. But the byproducts of the light-dependent reactions are sent out to the stroma and utilized to drive the Calvin cycle. So it does occur in the stroma. What do we need to drive the Calvin cycle? We definitely know we need what? What was produced during light-dependent? In the form of ATP and NADPH. Are necessary to give energy, but we also need ATP and NADPH are the energetics. What is critical to photosynthesis that we've not talked about? Carbon dioxide. Okay, very good. Carbon dioxide is necessary as well. Is that too light, Lori? I was experimenting with the colors, so if that's too light, just let me know. Once we have the right conditions, the right enzymes, the right inputs, what is our output? What's our product? Sugars. Okay. Here I just wrote the word glucose, but you could put sugars just as well. That's the short and sweet of photosynthesis. Okay? Light-dependent reactions use light photons to excite electrons from water to produce energy intermediates, NADPH and ATP. Okay? Once those are produced, they can be used in the Calvin cycle with the addition of carbon dioxide to make what? Sugars. Before I move on, I want to see if you're okay with the basic concepts. Light-dependent reactions produce ATP, NADPH, oxygen's released, and hydrogen ions. NADPH and ATP are used to power the what? Calvin cycle, which makes for us glucose, sugars, when what's available? And carbon dioxide. That's the gist of it, okay? At least I want you to walk away with that today, because we're going to add how this happens, okay? We can oversimplify this with this basic summary image. The light-dependent reactions, water, light, available, producing oxygen, ATP, and NADPH, which power the carbon reactions or the Calvin cycle to utilize carbon dioxide to make sugars. It's not that simple, though. The light-dependent reactions actually subdivided into two phases, okay, to separately produce ATP and separately produce NADPH. Okay. Here's another spot where you can get confused, so I want to point it out to you so you don't get confused. The reactions of the light-dependent reactions are called photosystem 2 and photosystem 1. Those are the different types of reaction centers. Logic tells us 1 happens before 2, right? However, these are numbered based on discovery, not on order of working, okay? So which occurs first? Photosystem 2 reactions occur before the photosystem 1 reactions. Again, it's not there to mess you up. Photosystem 1 was just discovered first. And so they just went in line. Well, then that's 1, this is 2, when it was discovered. If we look at photosystem 2, this is where the reaction center, the chlorophyll A in a reaction center, is going to receive a light photon. Okay? In other words, solar energy. There's already electrons sitting in that magnesium core, and they get excited. Okay, it's considered to boost. We're adding electrons already have energy, and they're slamming them with light photon, and so they just get really reactive when they absorb the light energy. Okay, so the light photon. Okay, so the electrons get boosted. Does that make sense? They have so much energy, and then we just elevate how much potential energy that they have in them. Once those electrons get boosted, they can go on and enter this pathway. But if we want the plant to continue to do its thing, we need to replace those electrons. And we said they come from where? Water. Okay, so the electrons can be replaced from a new molecule of water. Water is stripped of its electrons, of an electron, and that releases what? H2O is split, and electrons taken, we produce hydrogen ion. Okay, we can see now the electron's been taken. We got hydrogen ion and H2O. Take off a hydrogen, now we have oxygen. So the light-dependent reactions, will split water into hydrogen ion. I had it flashing to remind you that this is really important for where we'll go on Thursday. Okay, so I'll come back. That hydrogen ion is really important. The oxygen is also liberated. I believe we've confidently covered it, it could be used or sent out to the atmosphere. So photosystem 2 utilizes water to take its electrons. It produces hydrogen ions and oxygen. I'm going to come back to the hydrogen ion Thursday, but I just want to very briefly show how this potential energy is kind of related. So this scale on the left-hand side is illustrating energy levels. Okay, low is less, high is greater. This is representing that photosystem, the proteins and accessory pigments, with the chlorophyll A in the middle, right? That visual analogy I tried to give you earlier. Water is going to be utilized to give electrons to this system. And so all of this these yellow arrows are representing the potential energy in the electrons that are stripped from water, liberating hydrogen ions and oxygen. When hit with light, the electrons gain a lot of energy. And then we add energy to use it. Okay? So photosystem 2 is going to first just give our source of electrons. And this is where we'll pick up on Thursday. I'm going to have you guys read over this. If you have already, I want you to reread it. Try to look for some videos and kind of put it into practice. On your way out, if you could turn in your handouts, I'll grade those and return them to you as soon as possible.